So there were protests in Cuba, and you guys know my feelings on this. The U.S. embargo is greatly responsible for a lot of the harm there and the food shortage and the medical supply shortage and stuff. But also, I'm sure the Cuban government is authoritarian on certain fronts, and, that's not acceptable. So with those protests dying down, there were protests in the U.S. on the side of the original protesters in Cuba. I think the thing that they've been going with is SOS Cuba. I actually saw, when I was in D.C. for Crystal Kyle and Friends, I was close to the White House, and I saw the Cuban protesters who were doing the SOS Cuba thing. So these are people who want to basically overthrow the Cuban government. And Fox News made a big deal about these people. By the way, I was there, and there were maybe 30 people, 40 people. Now, I'm not besmirching them. They have free speech rights, and they can say and do whatever they want, but for them to make it seem like, there's tens of thousands of people in the street, it just didn't happen in D.C., even though that's what Fox News is pretending. Well, in Miami, there's a rather large population, and in Florida, there's a rather large population of Cuban Americans, and many of them are against the Cuban government. There's actually a really interesting backstory to this stuff. A lot of the people who were part of the previous regime or were elites in Cuba in the previous regime under Batista, when Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, those rather wealthier families fled to Florida. So you have, former Cuban elites who are now in Florida. And you also have, one of the things Fidel Castro did is he sort of trolled the U.S. when the U.S. said any Cuban who steps foot in America is immediately an American citizen. Fidel Castro was like, cool, bro. And then he emptied all the prisons and sent them all to Florida. Sort of a historic troll job. But anyway, so these people were protesting to overthrow the government in Cuba. And they're all throughout Florida, and they shut down a highway in Miami. Ron DeSantis' reaction to this is very noteworthy.
The streets of Havana are quiet today after clashes with Cuban authorities. While in Miami, demonstrators are out again. Protesters here have shut down major highways, one block for more than 6 hours on Tuesday. Traffic also brought to standstills in Tampa and Orlando. Florida's new anti-riot law, established in response to Black Lives Matter protests, targets road blockades like those seen this week. Signed into law by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis in April.
I think this bill that I'll sign into law shows the state of Florida takes public safety very seriously.
The law says in part, a person may not willfully obstruct the free, convenient, and normal use of a public street, highway, or road, and if they do, they're subject to felony arrest. Yet critics ask if legislators felt the law was needed to prevent road closures like those during Black Lives Matter protests, why was no one arrested under that law when roads were cut off during this week's Cuba protests? Police from 2 Florida departments tell NBC News there were several arrests, but the anti-riot law was not used. They say that's a matter of officer discretion.
It completely contradicts what they said when they passed this law, that it wasn't about Black Lives Matter, but it was a public safety issue. And now we look at what's going on in Miami, where they're shutting down major interstates, but yet there's no enforcement of the law. It's hypocrisy 101.
And what does it tell you about why the law was passed to begin with?
This law was always targeted to chill the First Amendment rights of Black people in the state of Florida.
Damn. So Ron DeSantis signed this law, this anti-riot law, which free speech advocates and First Amendment experts across the country denounced. And they said, this is deeply unconstitutional. But he signed this law and said, it's for public safety and it's for law and order, and you will get hit with a felony if you block a roadway. And even if somebody who's driving runs over a protester, there's not responsibility and culpability on the part of the driver. They say the protester shouldn't have really been in the road. So in a roundabout way, it sort of semi-legalizes vehicular manslaughter in these situations. So he was super tough on protests when the protesters were ideologically opposed to him. When it was Black Lives Matter, when it was left-wing protesters. In that context, he's like, crack down on the protests. Now we have Cuban Americans who are right-leaning, taking to the streets, blocking roadways, and crickets. Crickets. They did not enforce this new law, this law that makes it a felony. I mean, it goes to show you. It goes to show you. Partisan hack. There are no principles. He's not truly committed to free speech. You know, he's not truly committed to his law and order approach, public safety concerns, anti-riot position. It all depends on what the protesters believe, and then he changes his standard and changes his view on how the law should be enforced. If you're a right-wing protester, if you're Cuban American, carte blanche. We're going to let you get away with whatever you want to do. If you're BLM, if you're left-wing, we need law and order. Get out of the streets. This is a riot. We're declaring it a riot. And if somebody runs over you, you had it coming. I mean, this really pisses me off. It does. Because it also just undermines people's faith and trust in government. And it should. And it should. You see the double standards. The double standards are obvious. You know, and there's a million examples just like this throughout our entire system. I mean, mandatory minimums is a great example. If a white person and a black person commit the same crime, black person is much more likely to get a much harsher sentence. Death penalty. White person, black person commit the same crime, black person's much more likely to get the death penalty. I mean, this is all proven. This is all empirical. And here we have another brazen example of basically a criminal injustice system. We have at least a 2-tiered, probably a 3 or 4-tiered justice system. He just signed this anti-protest law. And now he's not enforcing it, but if it's BLM, they enforce it. By the way, just to be clear, my actual position is not, hey, crack down on the Cuban protesters and charge them all with felonies. No, I'm a deep believer in First Amendment and free speech and free expression and free protest. And so I think that both the BLM protests, left-wing protests, and the Cuban protests and right-wing protests, you need to let people peaceably assemble. You know? You have to. Maybe you get into a little bit of a gray area when it comes to blocking roadways. But certainly, I don't think that was classified as a felony before, and I don't think it should be classified as a felony. I get the idea of having to like clear the roadway to let traffic continue. I understand that for sure. But I think the original law was way too harsh, and it was an attempt to crack down on the free speech rights of left-wing protesters and BLM. And they're more than happy to trot it out and use it against people who they ideologically disagree with. But when they agree, they get a lot more leeway.